Judea, in the time of Jesus, is a Jewish province governed by the Roman Empire. All power, including that of life and death, is vested in one man, the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Pilate has 6,000 crack troops at his command. Up the road, in Syria, a further 30,000 soldiers are on call to back him up.
Rome had actually only been ruling Judea directly for the last 25 years by the time of Jesus, and so the control was still fairly tenuous and uncertain. So Pilate's main job is to make sure that law and order prevails in Judea.
If there's an obvious suspect anywhere in the killing of Jesus, it's Pontius Pilate. Pilate was the man who sent Jesus to be crucified. He has got to be the prime suspect. In the Bible, Pilate is made out to be innocent in the death of Jesus. But this may not be the whole story. In fact, all the evidence from sources outside the Bible paints a picture of a very different man. According to the historian Philo, writing at the time, Pilate was calculating, cruel, and often brutal. He also had an intense dislike of Jews. So much so that he based his headquarters here in the city of Caesarea on the Mediterranean coast and not in the Jewish capital, Jerusalem. Caesarea was 60 miles from Jerusalem, a good 2.5 days' march.
Pontius Pilate seems to have been arrogant, brash, and particularly insensitive in his treatment of the Jews. He probably had a typical Roman's disdain for any other culture, probably thinking that they weren't anything like as civilized as the Romans themselves.
But Pilate could not avoid his annual visit to Jerusalem for Passover. As Roman governor of Judea, it was part of his official duty to attend the most important festival in the Jewish calendar. To make his trip more bearable, Pilate took his wife with him to Jerusalem. Even so, there would have been a lot on his mind.
Pilate would have been particularly concerned about the preservation of law and order at the Passover. This was a great national feast that commemorated the time when the Israelites came out of Egypt into the Holy Land, brought there by God, shaking off foreign oppression. And so, of course, it was natural that at the time of the Passover, people started to think about Roman overlords. They started to think about nationality. They thought about foreign oppressors. And it's no accident whatsoever that nearly all of the riots that we hear about in the first century took place at Passover. So if there's going to be a Jewish revolt, it's almost certain to happen here in Jerusalem, quite probably in the temple. And if anything threatened to disturb the peace, Pilate would have stamped it out straight away.
Pilate had an extensive network of spies and informers right across the city. He would have known about Jesus and the following that he was gaining, and about some kind of incident in the temple. And now, the trial that Caiaphas had held only the night before, with its sentence of death. It is now just after sunrise on the morning after the trial. Caiaphas had sent Jesus to appear before Pilate because only the Roman governor could carry out a death sentence. Pilate was well known for having executed prisoners even without trial, but little would have prepared him for the strange case of Jesus of Nazareth. The charge which Caiaphas had brought against Jesus was blasphemy, a Jewish crime, and nothing to do with Roman law. But overnight, the charge had disappeared.
There would have been no reason for Caiaphas to mention blasphemy one way or the other. He didn't have to say anything about that at all because he had a perfectly good accusation to bring against Jesus that Pilate would listen to in a minute. Namely, Jesus was guilty of sedition. Jesus thought, or his followers thought, or people said that he was the king of the Jews. That would make him guilty of a very high crime against Rome, and that would get him killed very quickly.
This is alarming for Pilate. The case now has legal meaning under Roman law. It is a charge of sedition and treason, punishable by death. Pilate must take action and, at the very least, give Jesus a hearing. Roman trials were often held in public. A crowd began to gather in the fevered atmosphere of Passover Jerusalem as news spread that Jesus of Nazareth was on trial for his life. Pilate now asked Jesus if he was calling himself King of the Jews. Jesus made little or no reply. Pilate could find no evidence against Jesus and said, "This man is innocent." At this point, Pilate could have dismissed the case, but he had to take into account an unexpected factor: the crowd. His verdict of innocence angered them. They began to shout for Jesus to be crucified. It's quite possible that the crowd was a mob, whipped up by the chief priests to put pressure on Pilate. Pilate now faced a dilemma. Release Jesus, and there may well be riots. But why should he execute an innocent man?
Pilate is in a bit of a cleft stick because all that we know from him, from other sources as well as the Gospels, like the historian Josephus who writes about him, make it clear that Pilate really didn't care about offending people. And actually, when he looked at Jesus and read the reports that he'd had from his officials, it was quite clear Jesus wasn't leading a military revolution. So Pilate then says, "I don't find anything wrong with him. I don't think he's guilty of these charges."
Pilate then decides on what he thinks is a masterstroke. There is a Passover amnesty, which allows the Roman governor to release a prisoner. He offers the crowd a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, who is imprisoned for murder. Pilate is interrupted by the crowd, baying for him to release Barabbas and crucify Jesus. Unable to make a clear decision, Pilate tries to have it both ways. He passes an extraordinary sentence. Declaring Jesus to be innocent, Pilate nevertheless condemns him to death by crucifixion. This action alone is enough to incriminate Pilate as a suspect. Pilate then symbolically washes his hands before the crowd, telling them he is innocent of this man's blood. Jesus is taken away to be whipped. But for all his attempts to wash his hands of the affair, the very fact that Jesus was crucified puts Pilate firmly under suspicion. Pilate could argue, in his defense, that it was his duty as Roman governor to execute rebels who threatened the state. So was Pontius Pilate the man who killed Jesus? He had the power, but it was Caiaphas who had the motive. Pilate gave the execution order, but the crowd were shouting for it, demanding crucifixion. The idea of Jesus being complicit in his own death may seem controversial, but all the facts stack up. On many occasions, Jesus had the opportunity to leave Jerusalem. But every time he refused to take the easy way out. At no time during this fateful week did Jesus make any attempt to escape. He stood his ground. Judas betrayed him with a kiss, and the awful endgame began. Everything he had done since that first day at the gates of Jerusalem, every step of the way seemed to be the fulfillment of a destiny. The case against Jesus is strong. But no matter how often he put himself in danger, he did not take his own life. That was done by others. Let's review the evidence. The first suspect, Caiaphas, wanted Jesus dead. He considered Jesus a threat to his religious power and his privileged lifestyle. He held a sham trial and convicted Jesus of blasphemy.
Who is the guilty party is naturally Caiaphas. And I think that that's the right man to name. He is the guy who decided. So here's the man that I think is actually the guy who did it.
Pilate may have played an unwitting role in this crime. He saw Jesus as no threat. He declared him innocent. But Pilate had the ultimate power. It was he who ordered the execution of Jesus.
Of course, the one who convicted him and sentenced him to death was Pilate, the Roman governor. No question about that. Pilate has to take the responsibility for that.
The final suspect, Jesus. He knew exactly what he was doing and why. He deliberately provoked Caiaphas with his actions. He made no attempt to escape, and he refused to defend himself at his trial. Jesus was successful in achieving his goal, his destiny.